Warmly welcome everyone. My name is Anita Jori and I'm a co-curator of the festival program's discourse program of CTM, and I'm also a research associate at Berlin University of the Arts, and I will host this whole afternoon today. Warmly welcome once again to this research networking day. It's traditionally, let's say, the first day of the discourse program of CTM. And we invited different researchers, students from different fields to present their ideas about the festival topic, Liminal. And it's an international platform, research networking day for exchange. So as the name says, it's a networking day. So I really encourage everyone in the room to talk to each other and discuss also within the breaks, let's say, those different topics we are discussing here also today. And beside, the presenters today here, the students, there are a lot of other students in the room, as far as I know. Students, for example, from Berlin University of the Arts, from Humboldt University, and also from the University of Hildesheim. So warmly welcome here also in the room. And please always be encouraged to be part of the discussions we are having here today and ask questions and so on. So I also want to bring your awareness to the fact that every year we choose different cooperation partners for this research networking day. This year, the 3 cooperation partners are Berlin University of the Arts, the German Association for Music Business and Music Culture Research, the GMM in German, and Humboldt University of Berlin. And let's say some words about the topic of the festival, Liminal. As the description of the festival says, liminal phenomena and liminoid states are transitional phases in which a familiar order sees its values and symbols, established norms are suspended or turned on their heads. Liminality characterizes spiritual practices and social rituals, as well as aesthetic, psychedelic, and other transformative experiences. It marks technological upheaval and social, cultural, and political change. In music, bonder disturbing experiences and acts of transgression and partially negotiated and renegotiated. Such liminal spaces are zones whose limits or scope remain unknown. The liminal is the fundamental challenging of norms and identities. Celebration of liminality, hybridization, and transgression is not enough in and of itself. Rider Prize should be supplemented with critical evaluation and potentials, ambivalences, trajectories, and exclusions. So the festival raises several questions about liminality as follows. How do such experiences and practices affect political and cultural dichotomies? When do they merely serve to practice affect political and cultural dichotomies, and when do they reinforce known power structures, and when might they actually allow for gains in cultural freedom, and so on and so forth. So there's thousands of questions we are raising, and I'm really sure that today the presenters will also answer those questions, or at least partially answer them. And we have 3 modules today in the afternoon. The first one got the title, Feeling This, on sonic effects from unrest and euphoria. And unfortunately, the moderator of the festival of this module cannot be there, Alberto da Campo, because he just wrote me a text message that unfortunately he got sick. So I will moderate the first panel too. The second one got the title, The Sound of Change, Listening to Instability, and the moderator of this panel will be Stefanie Elisch, who is a visiting professor for the theory and history of popular music at the Institute for Musicology and Media Studies at Humboldt University of Berlin. Her research focuses on mazurka, kuduro, broken beat, groove, pleasure politics, and sound system epistemologies, among many other topics. From this module, we also have, unfortunately, 1 presenter missing, Elsa Gili, same reasons like Alberto, sick reasons, so unfortunately there will be only 3 presentations in the second module. And the last module will be moderated by myself. It got the title Resynthesize, Reframe, and Reimagine the Liminal Voice. So we will see what we'll get out of this topic too. And in this presentation, or in this module section, let's say, there will be unfortunately also 2 presentations only because Kaitlin Oriodian cannot be there. So that's a little change, let's say, in the program. If you don't have the program yet, or on your telephone, or however with you, there are a couple of printed versions at the counter at the entrance, so you can grab one if you would like to. Some words about the presentations. They're going to be very quick, about 10 minutes presentations. But since we have, let's say, those 3 people missing, I also encourage the presenters to talk a little longer. It's fine to, let's say, talk 12, 13, 14 minutes. It's totally fine because we don't have this time pressure from now on. And if you would like to ask, I'm talking now to the audience, a little more complex questions, let's say involving more people on the stage, I really recommend you to do that by the end of the day, because we will have a panel discussion, like a closing one around 6 p.m. So everybody will sit here all together and we will discuss once again all those topics we discussed. So if you want to ask your question only to the presenter, you can do it after the presentations, but if you want to raise more complex questions, like more people could answer, please do it around 6 p.m. in the final presentation, let's say, in the panel. And I would like to use this moment also to thank to the whole CTM team to organize this, this day, especially to the curatorial team of the discourse program, Tai Saraplensky, Jan Rolf, and Oli Zhang. Without them, we wouldn't have been here. And also for the production, Amélie Lille. Thank you so much for organizing with us. And also for the 3 cooperation partners already mentioned, Berlin University of the Arts, German Association for Music Business and Music Culture Research, and Humboldt University of Berlin. Also, thanks a lot for the technical support for those people who are behind the stages, and also generally for Bethanien for this beautiful location. And I think it's really enough what I just told about this whole afternoon as an introduction. I would directly jump into the first panel. And as mentioned, the first module got the title Feeling This, on Sonic Effects from Unease to Euphoria. So there will be a lot of presentations related to effect and feelings, hopefully. And I'm asking directly Tara Hill to come on stage. I will just say some words about her work now. Tara spent half of her life with On Food in the global techno movement, and the other in its critical reflection, first as fascinated raver and music journalist, later as a DJ and creator of temporary club projects, as well as keen reporter on the underground scene for Swiss and German dailies, magazines and blogs, nowadays as activist merging academic research and transcendental empiricism. And her project and her presentation's title is Politics of Ecstasy, Negotiating the Sacred in Contemporary Club Culture. So Tara, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Starting this festival with a presentation on Pirate Utopia, the politics of ecstasy, might seem a weird thing, but in my life I have been meticulously studying the dance floor as a primal scene of ecstatic culture, as one of the nucleus of society, as a music journalist, as a DJ, but also now as a sociologist for the University of Hamburg. So my approach was first the one of an autodidact, and actually going and synchronizing several different festival experience, ethnography into a more personal cosmology, a belief system, and then negotiating different approaches to think the festival throughout the world. Hopefully this critical process will by definition be non-doctrinaire, non-hierarchical, and anti-dogmatic. So this is how I work. The festival is a scenery that has caught my interest because compared to a very called classic Deleuzian chapter of 1,000 plateaus becoming animal, becoming imperceptible and becoming intense, it can also be structured as becoming one, is a very important feature of the dance floor, then becoming multiple, and maybe in a third step, becoming an agent of change. So this is because there's something innately powerful about the moment, especially the moment the dance floor erupts. It is as if all of a sudden some synchronizing force takes over the scene. The tableau turns into a threshold, in Latin limen, which coins the term liminality. What emerges is a plafond, a morphing and oscillating assemblage between music, people, scenery, and union in intensity. Even more so if we think geophilosophically, if the scenery we encounter does not play out in the darkness of a club, but in the outdoors. This is where the scenery really plays an important role. So this is what makes it a sacred space belonging to no one, and this might be the start of a progressive politics structured after affects and feelings of the experience of the participant. Liminality denotes a plateau of intensity experienced by festival goers in which the aggregate state changes, novelty begins, and haxeity, understood as a concept by John Duns Scotus, is the individuality of a moment ensues. Is everything melts into one, into a body without organs. Of course, at festivals with 70,000 or more visitors, such as the infamous Black Rock City at the Burning Man Festival, or the German Fusion Festival, which I have extensively studied. We speak about the size of a middle census city, which makes them a powerful player and a festival that reaches critical mass yet remains firmly steeped in the heterotopia or in the alternative culture. When crowd experience collective meltdowns and states of euphoria, what happens is it powerfully breaks down the walls between its members and turns them into a collectivity, a multitude of the moment. They become one, which marks a culture of the now, of the moment, which is a haxeity in itself. So it's a tableau where everything melts, and this points to some transcendental spark. So they reach out to infinity or eternity, or become a cosmological scene. In this environment, collective joy, jouissance, experienced as rite of passage and as a form of countercultural bonding, acts as a form of what Adorno called as a promesse de bonheur. The scene opens into the utopia and making another or a better world suddenly seem powerfully possible. So people that attend these festivals can become vectors of transformation, realizing that they have cathartic purges there at the festival, and maybe go back changed, sparking unthinkable new politics. Cathartic crowds enmeshed in ecstatic dance, they have always been studied meticulously by anthropologists first, then later by sociologists, and one of the things that is important about them is that they actually cater to the initiate. So they are traditionally not open to everyone, but is certain stages in life people might actually accept an invitation to become an adept or an initiate, which makes them a sort of occult or magic experience. So one of the first initiates that actually has very, very high prevalence and has extensively been debated in the 1968 movement was Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard professor deeply involved in progressive politics and in the use of psychedelic drugs in the hippie generation. And he coined his book, The Politics of Ecstasy. by which he means the experience of attaining freedom from limitations, either self-imposed or external, and a state of exalted delight in which normal understanding is felt to be surpassed. It's from the Greek, ecstasis, and it's an ongoing on-off process. So it requires not only one crystalline moment, but a continual sequence of dropping out. On the same occasion, when many individuals share the ecstatic experience at the same time, they create a brief lived counterculture of their own. Of course, one of the very legendary examples would be Woodstock Festival, 500,000 people strong, that sometimes has become the iconic event of the 1960 or 70 movements. Another sort of anarchist, more or outsider thinker that has become very important for technoculture is Hakim Bey, which he melts between his anarchist role and the role of a storyteller, producing also sort of theory fiction he called guerrilla ontology. And he's interested in where do we actually find places where we can suddenly create our own utopian ideals as a freedom-loving, progressive, anarchist society. The temporary autonomous zone is that what he coined and he seeks. And he says it's utopian in the sense that it envisions an intensification of everyday life, but also life's penetration by the marvelous. But it's not utopian in that it doesn't exist. So what he did is he started to study the tasks. He followed intersections of many forces, compared them to like some pagan power spot at junctions, and stressed the importance of the terrain, landscape, flow, air, water, animals involved in these temporary autonomous zones. What happens is that in temporary autonomous zones, a sort of place or scenery, or even a small village, so a territory suddenly takes off from mainstream society, forming a sort of in-between space of possibly complete autonomy. And this is a place where people then might slip into different and new identities, ways of being and relating, becoming fluid and wild in ways that usually are constrained on the surface of mainstream reality. So there are lots and lots of examples of how to think the temporary autonomous zone. I want to send on Pirate Utopias. Pirate Utopias is a book that he wrote in which he traced different pirate settlings that sort of formed mini-utopian settling, often centered around their very autonomous or countercultural rights. So he stresses their festive aspects and their slipping loose of the ideals of a mainstream society. So what happens is they are freed of time and place of usual roles, of usual morals and power structure, and are more an event-based society. So they usually psychotopology-wise indicate that the flow of forces is very free, and then they become spots of power through this festive culture they coin. So one of the things he studies is that a counterculture refuse mainstream culture, but on the other hand, they often coin or they create a festal culture that actually emerges in zones that usually are non-territorial, so zones from the margins, traditionally not from the high arts, somewhere around major networks or major metropolis, and remain hidden from view. So there, the fight for the right to party is in fact not a parody of the radical structure, but a new manifestation of it. So one of the strengths that these pirate utopias have is they stay invisible to the state. They can't recognize it because they don't really have a definition of it. So they are often semi-permanent leases, or there's word of mouth, or they are arranged by handshake, or just by settling somewhere in a spot that has opened up. So what happens is jazz often flourishes, and everything that happens there is sort of a secret. Like the initiation is compared to a cult, and they are very experimentative, so they try out new forms of society, often based on the ecstatic. So this means that pirate utopias can become microcosms of that anarchist dream of a free culture already practiced. This is what makes them really interesting. They are otherworldly in a sense that they create complete new utopian societies, and they are enclaves of pure freedom as long as they remain invisible or stay under the radar or fly off kilt. So some of these pirate utopias can be compared to the first tribal gatherings, but also anarchist meetings or nightclubs. But of course they become more and more powerful when they reach thousands or even 10,000s of celebrants, like a being, because ecstatic culture practice in pirate utopias is always open. It is ordered by sound, by the territory, but it is open to what happens within the zone. So there is something new happening. This is Black Rock City, seen from above. It's a Burning Man festival. One of the most powerful pirate utopias that has been extensively studied, and I will perform similar studies for European festivals that have reached similar critical mass. Why are these festival grounds so utopian and so autonomous, and why do they have such huge repercussions for mainstream society? Here we can go back to actually the Hellenic phase and quote Cicero, who has compared the Eleusinian mysteries of that time, that also was a ritual culture, a festive culture, somewhere like 20 kilometers of Athens, where people came to experience freedom through music and dancing and the performance of the spectacle of the tragedy, which also has inspired Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, from music. So he compares that these Eleusinian mysteries have actually refined the state of the civilization they come from, and they are powerful initiations. So they actually let people learn from these new beginnings of life and new forms of society. And people who have visited the Eleusinian mysteries have gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope. So, coming from the antique, there has been quite some research in the past 20 years on how to think this return of the tragic, of the tragedy, or of the mystery, Mysterienspiel in postmodern societies. One of them is the French sociologist Michel Mefisoli, the one who also coined the term neo-tribes, and he stresses the culture of pleasure, the sense of tragic, the confrontation with destiny, and both the cause and the effect of an ethics of the moment. And this actually marks a very, very important part of postmodern culture, which then actually finds its astonishing return of archaic values to the forefront of the social scene. So things like tribalism and nomadism, that technomadism has been extensively studied. So this makes the festival one of the very important places to study such new form of the re-emergence of the archaic. One of the festivals I have extensively studied is Fusion Festival, and we can actually see in a German festival, in a very recent example, of how these things happen. Fusion Festival has been flying under the radar for almost 22 years. It's based on an old Soviet rocket station, so a rocket launch station, which is coined the name and also all its symbols. And it has been a well-kept secret, not indulging in PR or marketing of any sorts, and they never ever put out a lineup. So you just go there every year, and in the end, nowadays there are 70,000 people. And the interesting thing is that there are about 500,000 people who would like to go, so they don't just give away the tickets. It's just one big Wettbewerb. So you can just go on the internet and then type in your name, and maybe you're lucky and you win, or maybe you have to go next year. So what happened is with some political changes in the area, there were new forces in the police that thought it was time that this event had created a critical mass, and actually realized that there was virtually no police stationed on the festival ground, which is of course a really special situation compared to football games. So what they wanted was they demanded a new security concept, actually putting the police on the grounds of the festival. And this, of course, in the eyes of the Fusion Festival Committee, would have hampered with its idea of a completely autonomous zone, where people can roam around freely and have no rules applying to mainstream, normal, everyday society. So this was a big discussion last summer in German newspapers and even TV stations. And in the end, they reached a compromise. So there was some police stationed in the beginning, just at the entrance, and actually it proved that it wasn't necessary. I think they had like 7 or 8 different Einsätze, so things to do, and it was all minor. So in future, the hope persists that actually the Fusion Festival will remain an autonomous zone. So this shows that actually the battle between a nation state trying to see that its rules are followed in an increasingly networked society can be overcome through temporary autonomous zones. So this is what I'm looking at in my PhD more closely from different examples. And I want to see how exactly this happens, these negotiations of temporary autonomous zones, and how they become precarious laboratories of ordered social disorder and civil disobedience and resistance against mainstream culture. So the relation to the state of these festivals is often a complex one, because where wiser men, especially older politicians or even the ex-police chief who is retired, see that they perform a very important social role as to setting a stage where people can experience freedom for a short time. So it's important for the people partaking as an initiation, but also to test new social initiatives and to see whether a grassroots self-regulating society is possible in a temporary way. So as in Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries that performed this important role for Athens, for the mainstream culture of the Hellenic age, we can say there are very numerous initiatives coined in between these temporary autonomous zones, then going back to Berlin and to Berlin's club cultures, there is a very vivid exchange and interaction. So ideas circulate that might prove to be better suited in the club culture of the capital, and then others that go beyond that, inspired by maybe the approaches also of Burning Man, where there is no money, and where they leave no trace. Ideas like that can become tested here in Germany also. So Graham St. John, who will also speak here later at this conference, is one of the doyens and the most respected researcher on festival culture internationally. He started with psytrance, and he has written extensively about Burning Man and its contributions to a progressive politics and a new society. He says trance events have an uncanny ability to capture an era, captivate an audience of travelers, occupying the eternal theater of the dance floor. Their tendency is to thwart the passage of time, to prolong the night, and for these people attending, then maybe after adopt a liminal lifestyle for a longer period of time. So amid the whole carnival, there is also peaceful repose. You have limbs, bodies, sunflowers, everything melting around into one, producing intense joy in the on the dance floor and the surrounding areas. This enables people to experience the moment, the flow, the experience you are all, and the living evidence also that nothing lasts. And it's a deep revelation of the mystical function of trance for society, and it's difficult to emerge from this little death, as it is called, because you reach a new state of being, feeling, and leave your old self behind. And also a lot of people experience intense euphoria, so they don't want the party to end. But it must end so that it can recommence and close the cycle. And this is because festival culture is liminal time mostly, but first and foremost liminal space. So it means we go on a journey, we form a camp, and we perform all of these typical elements of what's in the sacred is called a vision quest or a rite of passage. There's the three states. First, you go separation from your normal life. Then you go on a journey, meeting new people, meeting new experience, being in the in-between or transitory states. And then you reach the threshold where you leave your old self behind, plunging into the precarious wide open and thus losing your old self and returning a new person or a new being. And as the Dionysian element is key to the ecstatic, then this marks a process which is very wild and chaotic, and in the end turns then into a powerful initiation through Thoria and trance. This is Boom Festival, which Graham St. John has studied. So what are the lessons taken from these experiences? It's actually really through the perfectly orchestration of the liminal that is design of the stages, the music, the lights, the people occupying all sorts of job, intermediary, the whole gastronomic concept, the village around, the infrastructure. It's become huge hubs catering to this sacred spectacle. And it's actually meant for a week to be such an intense experience that, akin to some archaic or indigenous spiritual festivals like Sundance, the exhaustion of the people is part of the ecstatic, so that bodily boundaries might be crossed, social roles might be transgressed, and again they experience a little death, and in Burning Man they burn a little figure of themselves in the end, so to have some symbolic closure of the ritual. What happens after people leave festivals? This points to the process of the reintegration of the initiate back into its society. In traditional societies, the liminal subject, the one that is attending a rite of passage, is characterized as polluting. In a sense, he powerfully crosses the taboos of purity and is therefore temporarily stripped of his former social status. So he is a bit like a homo sacer, an outlaw, and he belongs nowhere. His old status has vanished, and the new one he becomes at the end of a successful initiation. This is, of course, a very interesting concept because the status of being betwixt or in between has been traditionally ascribed to shamans, dropouts, outcast, marginalized people, minority, and of course agents of counterculture. So usually what happens in these mystery games or ecstatic dance in traditional society is you have a ritual and then you have a closure moment that everything stays there. The circle closes and there is silence, there is a vow of taboo of what happens. And then, like in Burning Man, a lot of these traditional festivals actually just vanish. So they try to leave no trace. Also thinking of the ecological systems of the sacred space. Now, we face a different situation that actually this cycle doesn't really close. So we experience festivals go back into maybe metropolis or big city. I find there our normal club culture as a sort of mixture between a home away from home, so a small circle of community, and that also performs ecstatic rites. And it is very interesting that now in the past couple of decades there are forming circles that want to actually take this festival experience into the midst of the city and make it a new sprout or germ for a new society actually founding on the experience of the ecstatic together. So what happens is through these powerful becoming ones, the people that have partaken in these rituals or in these places, they found the society on this dance floor moment. And from this, they sprout out several initiatives to actually spread this experience of oneness, of up to other concepts, to one world concepts, or to concepts of like peace, love, unity, respect, or to the concepts of a political resistance and micropolitics. So what I will do in the next couple of years is actually trace how these concepts have filtered back into club culture. Do they render club culture more political? Is this really possible to just found a new society on temporary autonomous zones, such as clubs, big club projects, or now temporary autonomous zones in big cities? And we'll have a look at different different projects that actually try to use this experience of the festival not just as a pollutive one, but as a cross-pollination one. So actually what we have achieved is we have defended several of these temporary autonomous zones. So they have a certain critical weight now, which is the moment where the taboo about the initiation and about these rights might be dropped to actually become a powerful political voice about the chances of these ecstatic communities becoming powerful negotiators of how to live in a largely stratified, hierarchical and very complex mainstream society. So if we look at these small villages, there's projects like the Holzmark, for instance, have started, or even a club project like Griesmühle, which is at the moment just trying to fight to prolong what they have built up in Neukölln. We can powerfully trace these micropolitics that really become very, very important social initiatives, sometimes as the last couple of years have shown, then really being agents of major political change through ecstatic ritual. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Thank you so much, Tara. I have just a very quick question, and I will give then the questions to the audience, because you said that you're going to work on this negotiation in your PhD. You said, I think you are in the beginning or the first phase, or like...
Yes, yes.
And how are you going to do that? I'm interested in this methodology, that this, I think, because liminal spaces or in liminality, exactly this negotiation is, I think, a powerful thing to do. How are you going to measure it or analyze it between authorities and clubs and festivals and so on? Yeah.
It's a very good question, and this is why I put in the quote of the music critic, that you actually enmesh with all the aspects and then try to distill a sort of cosmological aspect or cosmological foundation out of it, and then you take these out and form archetypes, which is a bit easier than just going in and doing a discourse analysis, because many of these initiatives are really shrouded in secrecy and they don't want to come out. They don't want people to actually come in there with the cameras filming everything at the ritual, as in Berghain, who has a no photo policy, is difficult to just work with talk and text. So I think the enmeshment in the process is very important, which is of course the classical ethnographic approach of participant observation. Then to speak to key figures, our key collectives, very importantly, it's not structured hierarchically. There is no, even the DJ is not the shaman king, because these festivals, they are organized through committees that are largely made out from political activists of all sorts of backgrounds. So one important thing will be to study how these collectives work, because they are very grassroots based. A lot of it works nowadays through new social media and planning, and then they are very loose structured, so not everybody is aware of everybody else, which is important. And then you just try to trace the working of a collective, and of course then to speak to the initiate himself. There has been some rise of a blog scene around all this festival experience. There is way more information on Burning Man, because there people do preliminary courses, or when they are a virgin, they get initiated separately and come back and write tutorials or form self-help groups. So how to negotiate the experience on a more personal group level. It is what is also happening in festivals like Nowhere Festival in Spain, which is a European version, a small version of Burning Man, that you get an introduction into the principles of consent, the principles of openness, the principles of leave no trace, and at the end of the week you can go to group help therapy and talk about how you can implement this overwhelming experience into your default life, or maybe work towards integration of the two. The other thing is that a lot of these festivals actually aid in people taking some time off and after phase, like usually in a vision quest is done. So they separate again in groups, and they go somewhere deep into unspoiled nature, liminal spaces in nature like mountains, mountain lakes, or the sea, and just go there for decompression and have some sort of purification ritual. So that is what a lot of people do to then actually gather the strength to distill the experience and go back into the society as a stable, closed self again, not as someone who has become hybrid and might feel quite psychotic coming back into normal society after such an experience.
Yeah, I think Graham John will talk about it probably on Wednesday. So if you're interested in this topic, please come also on Wednesday to the discourse program. And I'm giving questions to the audience. Yes, there is one question there.
Thank you.
Could you elaborate on your work as a researcher in a scenery that is like a political action? What is your role? How do you feel like you're not a part of it, but still part of it, to see how authentic it is? Because that is something that would be very interesting to see, even though you told on stage you've been working on fusion and doing research there. I'm very interested in what your next steps will be and how you see yourself as a researcher in that role.
One of the more methodological problems I encountered was that I was a festival goer, also almost a technomad, so I was away part of the year just to go from one festival to the other, first as a music journalist usually, and then a lot of times I went into volunteering just because when I thought a festival was really special or progressive, I wanted to find out more about how it works behind the scenes. And music critics or media has always a bit of a difficult role talking to the underground. They are often misrepresented, and often they pamper with the powerful taboos of not to speak to a greater audience of what happens. So what I did was just gathered experience as volunteer, but I stated that I actually was planning a PhD that might take a couple of years to set together, and then go in and try to see the festival from a very different perspective. I have seen it as a central stage DJ, for instance, which was a very different experience than being a volunteer in the care team, or in the mindfulness-based lead before at Burning Festival. So what I'm trying is to distill all these experience and just find agents or experts on these key fields that form the backdrop of the festival, which is better than just writing to an email address that might just be the introduction to any one of the committee answering the question. And of course you can always talk to people and participants, especially the ones that are determined to put this experience into starting a new life or into progressive politics. So this is where we have to trace these events as a linear series of sprouting and spreading out into different subcommittees. This is what Graham St. John is doing very well for the worldwide effect of Burning Man. So I'm trying to do something similar for the German festival scene, and if I can, then look at the festival scene in a couple of other more remote European countries.
Any other? Yeah, there are a couple of more questions.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you have any practical advice for festivals, clubs and promoters, how to create that zone that you were describing, and also maybe to reach that state of transcendence, and also if you have experienced how festivals implement spiritual practices, like rituals, any ceremonies that might also help to initiate that state.
It's a very important question, because we actually lack a tradition, or we have been cut too far off from traditional festivity, which was very entrenched in spiritual practice. So what we need to think about is how to put these experiences that, per definition, actually transcend language. And they are, of course, bodily experiences. They are powerful experiences of an even outer body experience of becoming a larger body, as a body without organs. And then people sometimes flip around afterwards, not sure how to integrate and how to speak with this experience. Their Burning Man has a very powerful tradition, because it comes from these, it's very inspired by Indian rituals, festive rituals of Sundance, rain dance, and so on. And there is a very powerful community talking about the spiritual in Indian culture, so in a post-colonial way, and how we can use this insight, this spiritual insight. The same is with the quote on Afrotopia that I've taken from Fred Winizar. This is a book by a progressive post-colonial activist, professor of economics in Africa, who works closely with the French government on how to negotiate post-colonial politics, and he has written this book, Afrotopia, because he thinks we need a new cosmology, not necessarily one that is suitable for the entire world, but Africa has rested very strongly on such tribal structures, and they are always religious or spiritual structures, and they have always been celebrated through movement. So he says this is what makes Africa actually very special, and they have a lot of expertise on that, on how to negotiate violence, troubles, social hierarchies, fights, colonial struggles, struggles between the sexes, but also diets, hunger through ritual. So this is something that we can learn from Africa, because they have this tradition, and it's just actually a process of seeing the worth, the immense worth in these rituals and this ecstatic culture, to form an egalitarian culture of ecstatic rituals, and what it performs in society. So he thinks we should bring together these complementary worlds of the more high culture idea world, which is very open and progressive when it comes to art or music and art festivals, such as here, but then also go and dig out huge amounts of knowledge that are around in Timbuktu, for instance, in other big library, they have been preserved. So there is maybe really much interest and much wisdom in studying these African concepts. So to ensure that these complementary worlds just don't stay parallel universes, but merge into one world, a revolution that he says is a spiritual one, or a path to spirituality, but also for the self of the individual.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of more questions, but I'm very sorry, but we don't have time to all of them. Please keep them for the final presentation, because every single person on the stage will come back again once at 6 p.m. I'm sorry about it. Yeah, we have to move to the next presentation. Thank you so much, Tara, once again. Thank you. And Jasemine Khaleli is the next presenter. She's from the University of Vienna, graduated in visual arts, music, and modern media studies in Marburg, Germany, and is now completing a master's in musicology at the University of Vienna, Austria. With a strong interest in marginalization across the lines of gender and migration in sonics, Jasemine conducted also field research in Lisbon, working closely with collectives such as Mina, Suspension, and KitKat. Engaging with the topography of queer feminist nightlife activism, Khaleli also joined the research team of sounding out the tourist city, sound tourism, and the sustainability of urban ambiences in the post-industrial city. And her presentation's title is Raving Potentialities Undoing the Field.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much, Anita. Thank you so much, Tara. I think there's a very interesting ground open up for me maybe to build on. I'm very excited to share some current thinking that I'm working through as part of my one-year research in Lisbon. That I wrote a text and I'm going to read it to you. My research topics were centered around queer nightlife making in the neoliberal and tourist city. And while a large part of my research methods was based on formal and informal interviews with the organizers, DJs, and artists beyond the musical performances, I also and firstly spent a great amount of time in intensive participation to those events. So that is where I would like to draw attention for today, to the journey of accessing and experiencing queer feminist nightlife space through fieldwork that is still at the core of the discipline of ethnomusicology. More precisely, I'm posing the questions of how research in technospaces is experienced at the very micro level of my own body, how this challenges conventional data collection methods, and in doing so, how the tensions can be scrutinized, between ethnomusicological doing and the doing of ethnomusicology, between the bodily practice of research and the body of the discipline. The disorientated gaze. I'm breathing the city in. My body is an archiving storage. To be orientated, Sarah Ahmed writes in Queer Phenomenology, is to be turned towards certain objects. They gather on the ground and they create a ground upon which we can gather. End quote. This means we can live in the same space as others, but off their lines, bypass them, move over or underground, but be comforted by other gathering objects and bodies reachable to us. Fieldwork, we could say, interrupts oneself and one's being in the world, on the ground, and it reconfigures one's identity as never only one. Autoethnography in fieldwork, in many ways, is an exploration of that ground, privileging the knowledge gained through direct lived experiences within our bodily horizon. What does it mean, at the arrival in a new spatial field, in the very momentum of disorientation, to feel directed toward what and who? Does it matter how we arrive at the places we do? Certainly, being lost takes us somewhere, and it is especially rave culture's well-known ritualization of losing oneself that marks the transcendence of those experiences. There is a consent that the production of musical knowledge on performance is itself performative. In stressing out the active, in intentionally verbing the terms to do the field, we might elasticize the fixities of norms and concepts and embrace processuality and the multiplicities of understanding instead. The serendipities that we might experience in this very feeling of being lost could, maybe, be seen as both affect and methodology. It can build the ground for this kind of future-orientated indeterminacy that José Esteban Muñoz envisions in Cruising Utopia. A quotidian sensory experience that glimpses the performative potentiality of the not yet here. In what way, then, does this queer-inspired notion of lostness may allow us to rethink the encounters of bodies in ethnographic research? The exotic gaze. First performance. Naked bodies moving in a dehumanized slowness, running down the marble stairs like viscous fluids. Take a photo, the creatures command directly to me. I straighten myself up and attempt to empower myself. Straighten myself up for the always dominant act of a photographic shoot. Second performance. Headphones handed out at the entrance of the club. Volume adjustable, they say. A small plastic bag with 2 yellow stickers and a triangular blue pill is also given to us. It's dark and foggy inside. A person pushes their way through the room towards the DJ booth. Combat boots, kinky accessory. Este é espaço seguro. O teu lugar é aqui. Não te sentes livre? This is a safe space. Your place is here. Don't you feel free? A woman's voice through the headphones of a 50 minutes rave simulation. The exploitation by the traveler spectator, longing for some kind of ancient authenticity, has been a long-lasting affair. Both disgusted and drawn in by the peculiar power of ecstatic behaviors, repetitive drums, stomping feet, tribal dancing. What does it mean when certain elements that are considered to be essential to rave become colonized and commodified by the exotic gaze? Or when they are misconceptualized by the moral supremacies of society that remain centered around the material, the visual, the straight lines of structure? A few weeks ago, the anthology Queering the Field, Sounding Out Ethnomusicology was published, edited by Gregory Bartz and William Cheng. Several scholars vocalized their queer concerns of doing fieldwork or the necessity of queering fieldwork, a practice that relies on norms but cannot and must not be normalized. To normalize the core practice of fieldwork, making it follow a straight path, a straight set of rules, seems a violent act given that musical practice frequently involves improvisation, spontaneity, the release of expectations, and reassignment of responsibilities. Editor's end quote. This can be even more highlighted by engaging with queer-identified, loosely organized secretive communities that are perhaps and justifiably skeptical of external scrutiny. Hence, in considering how the own acts of studying and representing people are always acts of domination, I do not present the voices of my research interlocutors through my own voice. Obviously, any sort of nightlife fieldwork requires flexibility and sensibility to any inappropriate or potentially harmful activities, and its success, failure, is ultimately negotiated between all actors, the researcher and the interlocutors as co-performers. And does fieldwork even have a destination? The empiric gaze. Entrance. Orientation towards objects. Overloaded courtroom, bananas, merged leaflets. Stay hydrated. Dark room to the left, covered by heavy curtains. Read the guidelines first. Condoms, earplugs, tubes handed over with a warm smile. DJ booth on the right, stairs at the back, tattooist bus in the corner. Bar. Someone stretching out their latex booted leg on the counter. Like snapshotting, I recite to myself what my light-sensitive eyes focus on. An arm grabs and hugs me. It's good to see you. Being lost is a way of inhabiting a space by registering what is not familiar to us. And in dwelling such threshold spaces, we may find sources of excitement and experiment. In taking a route and tracking it down, we can visualize the contours of how we perceive space and how we are affected by the what and who we come into contact with. This redirects our gaze towards our own assumptions, biases, and desires one brings to the field. In doing a queer field of study, the doing becomes queer. In a field where gender and sexual identity is a pivotal aspect of belonging, the constant framing of one's own identity becomes unavoidable and maybe uncomfortable. But by oscillating between raving researcher and researching raver, by situating the experiences in the intersecting roles of observer, participant, dancer, journalist, consumer, and friend, we may become augmented versions of our previous selves. And that is central to meaningful encounters, community building, and counternormative solidarity. The hypervigilant gaze. Around me density, darkness, flashing strobe lights, humidity, sweat, intoxication, aggression, intimacy, at heightened beats per minute. I stare at the moving bodies around me and some pop-eyed look back. I feel as much suspiciously watched as I observe their exposure. Naked male shoulders perform occupancy. I don't know exactly where I should set my boundaries. I guess the ethnographer's trusty camera would help you to hold on. You, alienated, sensationalist, lonely researcher participant. Someone's showing me my own profile picture. Isn't that you? This here is a safe space. Don't you feel safe in my presence? And actually, do I feel safe? Safer spaces, closely intertwined with the economies of self-indulged individualism and neoliberalism, are a current buzzword and a cause for both celebration and ambivalence. The often celebrated being together in temporary autonomous zones, of course, does not imply a coherent single togetherness of the crowd, and in many aspects, those spaces mirror, solidify, and reaffirm the power asymmetries of the outside. The constant negotiations between belonging and alienation, self and community, inclusion and exclusion are inflicted by the process of how bodies occupy their place through the experience of the other. And the place within the other depends on power geometries, the power of looking at and being looked. Here, the body can be dissociated from itself. In clubbing, symptomatically at the doorsteps takes place what Martin Zabraki frames as subcultural capital is done via the self and transpersonal. We can also think here of Judith Butler's statement that one is not simply a body, but in some very key sense one does one's body.
Drawing on the feminist tenet of the significance of performativity in shaping bodies and worlds, one becomes self-existentially aware of doing oneself legible and trustworthy. And by rehearsing, reliving, and re-listening over time, cultural knowledge materializes itself in our body, reminding us of the past and the passage of time. The withered gaze. It's quiet up here, and one wonders how the city absorbs all its noise that is still pounding in my ear. The last 12 hours are impressed on my body, the texture of my skin, the rhythm of my exhausted muscles. The blank paper in front of me is a still life, a derision to my question of how to channel my drained memories. How to theorize a person that becomes a friend, how to theorize myself, how to other myself. Recalling Stefanie Menrath in Anonymity performance in electronic pop music, the culmination of a research project is its staging, on the page, in ethnographic writing, or performed before an audience. Embracing risks and the always given possibility to fail, I am wondering about the potentialities of revealing gaps and the messiness of fieldwork, of carving out room for choice, conflict, and randomness. I conclude this presentation by asking about the very performance of scholarly practice. Asserting that science enacts reality of research, the vignettes of field notes derive from my experience of moving in, but also moving to and moving from techno events. They are fractured, filtered, and fictionalized, and pose the question of how to align the wordless encounters in the field with forms of narration. How to align, to be in line, to be orientated in disorientation. Then, in celebrating empathy, inquisitiveness, and care, we might be able to contribute to the capacity of academia to tell better, less binary stories of the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasemine. Is there any question from the audience? Yeah, there is one person. It's coming.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, you as a researcher, but as also at least presented as a female, do you really feel safe in the club culture, especially in Berlin?
Well, I cannot say anything about Berlin's club culture, actually, like I did my research in Lisbon. Especially in places that are considered to be or aim to be safer spaces. I think I felt unsafe in my very being of being an ethnographer in this place, and this is something that creates a kind of dissociation from, am I just participating and interacting with the people, or am I constantly questioning my own self, but also what the others are doing. I think the very feeling of feeling unsafe came directly from this double or more than doubled position in the field. Also because probably you will always have, like, there are some certain costs that you have as a field researcher in nightlife, not just like the exhaustion and the poor sleep patterns, for example, but also asking yourself, like, to what degree you want to participate in certain rituals. And I think this poses the question of feeling safe or not safe. Because you're gonna, if you do field research in those places, I think you will be pretty much aware of exposing yourself and your doing. And this is something that I wanted to show, that there's a lot of interaction going on between myself and the other in those spaces.
Thank you very much. Did you say that you do or do not expose yourself in the conversations with those people?
I do.
You do. And the second question is, you as a participant, how much distance do you need, or do you feel like you need to the field that you work in? Or do you think that the distance is actually not necessary at all and you should be as close as to the field as possible?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a very important question that I don't have a proper answer on. Like in my perception, I think I cannot approach those spaces from the distance without falling in the trap of exoticizing those spaces. That is the chapter of the exotic gaze. Like, I'm pretty much aware of this danger, so I try to be as inside the scene as possible. Yeah, which then in the end poses the question of how to regain a kind of distance, to at least find some words to describe what was happening.
There's another question here in the front.
Thank you for your presentation. Recently, I actually started to doubt this idea of a safe space, and I don't know if it's desirable even. Like, does it really make people free, or is it actually limiting some possibilities because of this like binary of inclusion, exclusion? It's like, yeah, it also kind of creates convention, like inevitably. What do you think about it? Like,
Yeah.
what was your thoughts?
Well, I think the idea of creating some kind of safer spaces, let's frame it like this, is very important in our society. But of course, it's like a utopian idea that I think it cannot be achieved, and maybe should not be achieved, because these spaces cannot be seen as separated or sealed off the society that creates the needs for them to exist, of course. So we will find the same, or to a certain degree, the power asymmetries of the outside, like, for example, my own positionality as being having some privileges, as being like a female, able-bodied, cisgender, straight female going in these spaces. We will find the same privileges of the outside also in there, and of course it reaffirms some certain asymmetries. But I also think not to reproduce this constant narrative of building up safe spaces. It's still very important trying to create certain spaces that in some ways achieve to remix the conditions of the outside.
Thank you. Do you think, like, according to this question, like, safe space is part of the liminal era, or like it's a temporary thing we have, and then maybe one day we don't need that?
Wow.
You can give a speculation.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think it's maybe an output of this liminal era, but I'm not sure if we will ever be in the place to say we won't need it. I think our society, or the societies that we are living in, they are constantly re-enabling certain structures that do not allow to make those safer spaces like a proper living in the outside in society. Yeah.
We will see.
We will see.
Thank you so much once again, Jasemine.
You're welcome.
And the last presenter of this module is Steve Garofano. So Steve, the stage is yours. Steve is from Humboldt University of Berlin and is a musician and a neuroscience researcher based in Berlin and New Orleans. He's concluding a master's degree in cognitive neuroscience at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain at Humboldt University, where his research investigates the brain's mechanisms for the perception and production of musical rhythm. A professional drummer, Steve has experienced the power of rhythm to connect humans across cultural and geographic lines. And his presentation title is Entertainment in the Space Between Perception and Action.
Hello. How's everybody doing? How do you make this thing big in German? What's the word for bigify?
Sorry, it's in German, so
yeah.
I will help you. And then forget.
I need all the help from my German friends that I can get. Yeah. Right on, right on. Greetings. Yes, my name is Steve, and I have the good fortune of working with a team at Charité under the guidance of Dr. Gabriel Curio and Dr. Gunnar Vaderstraat. And we've been doing some research into neural entrainment, which is a mechanism through which the brain is able to track rhythm through time. In the case of our work, musical rhythm. And so we're gonna talk about this. I myself have been a musician much longer than I have been in the brain business. And in particular, my work as a drummer has dealt with being a live drummer in electronic situations, dealing with loops and samples and things like this. So a lot of what I've done as a musician has dealt with issues of synchronicity, between a human and a machine. So this work has been full of interesting insight for me. Let's see, maybe you will find it similarly interesting. This dude, Christian Huygens, I don't know how to say his name. My Dutch is as bad as my German. Was one of the first observers of this phenomenon that we call entrainment, which is a process by which two oscillating systems come into a synchronicity. This fellow, Christian, was bedridden with an illness, and he was producing pendulum-driven clocks, and there were two of these clocks across the bedroom from him, and he noticed that these clocks would synchronize over time, and even if they were perturbed, if one of them was bumped so that they swung out of synchronization, they would eventually re-synchronize out of phase, and he puzzled over this while being ill, and so he was the first describer of this phenomenon, and basically what we're talking about are these two or more independent systems oscillating and achieving a synchronicity because of the interaction of forces between them. So this is something that we see in a lot of natural systems. Most relevant for me, given that I am jet-lagged and also a nocturnal person, is that our bodies synchronize. Our circadian rhythms, our patterns of sleep and wake are entrained to the solar cycle. So when the sun is up, we're wakeful. When the sun goes down, we get sleepy. As the hours of daylight shift through the seasons, our wake and sleep cycles shift accordingly. We are entrained to the solar cycle. But this is also something that we can talk about on a variety of in a variety of disciplines. In psychology, let's say, if we are having a conversation, we are to some degree entrained to one another. We're paying attention to the timing of what I'm saying and when will you speak, when will I speak. In order for us to communicate, we have to have some sort of synchronicity. And in the case of music, we see entrainment, this kind of synchronicity, on a lot of levels, in the sense that if we go to the Philharmonic, obviously the conductor is creating a pulse for the orchestra to follow. The audience is listening to the orchestra. They are entrained to the music that they're hearing. Dancers are entrained to the band. So to me, it's a fascinating thing to consider that when we're all at the club or in the concert hall, we're not only synchronized to the music, but in being synchronized to that pulse, we're also synchronized to each other. But let's move forward. Let's talk about brains. Brains are made of neurons, and the concept that I just want to introduce right here is that in this single neuron, at this end we have dendrites, which are receiving signal from their neighbors, and that signal is traveling down the length of the axon to downstream neighbors. And this is an electrical impulse, and that's a signal that we can measure at the scalp using a technique we call EEG, which involves a net of electrodes worn on the head. These electrodes detect voltage changes as the cells in the brain are firing. They're producing these electrical fields. And so EEG measures this in real time with high temporal resolution. It produces data that looks a bit like this if we choose to visualize it. My first encounter with EEG in the lab, I thought it looked like digital audio. Personally, it looks like multi-track linear waveforms to me. And interestingly, when you are working with this kind of data, you're using techniques that are very familiar to people who work with digital audio. You're using shelving filters and bandpass filters, and we're trying to pull a signal out of noise, which is something that's familiar to anybody who has worked with a distorted guitar, for example. But each one of these lanes represents one electrode and the signal that it's picking up as we move left to right through time. So when we talk about rhythm, we can talk about it in a number of ways. We can represent it in kind of traditional musical notation, the top lane there. This is kind of your 4 on the floor boom chick, that's familiar to everybody in Berlin. You've got 4 bass drum notes on the quarter note. There's a hi-hat note on the offbeat, and then let's say that there's a cymbal crash on the downbeat of each bar. So if we were to represent that as digital audio, this is the waveform that you would be familiar with in Pro Tools or Ableton. But if we consider that you are listening to this rhythm as it passes by, there is going to be corresponding electrical activity in your brain, which would be reflected in this EEG time series if we were recording from your head while you were listening. And so the concept here is that if we had good data and good techniques, we could extract from this EEG signal oscillations reflecting your brain's activity, and we would find oscillations that correspond to the rhythm that you're listening to. So in this case, we have this quarter note at 120 beats per minute, which if we express as a frequency, that's 2 cycles per second, that's 2 hertz. So we would find this oscillatory waveform at 2 hertz, the beat frequency right here. We would also find a component that corresponds to the meter frequency. So if we have this event that happens on the 1 every time, that's a pattern that's happening at a frequency of 0.5 hertz. So we would also see this oscillatory component. And when I learned that, I thought that was fascinating. In our work, we were dealing with polyrhythm, which is a complex form of rhythm wherein you have sort of these non-factorial rhythmic groupings. You have 3/2. There are polyrhythms that are other organizations, but in this case, 3/2 is about as simple as you get, and you have 3 notes happening in the span of 2 notes. So that's something that doesn't resolve. If you were to program it in MIDI on a duple grid, you would see that those 3 don't fit squarely into the grid based in 2. So the question is, how does the brain track these 2 independent rhythms? That's something that we pursued, and so you can think of a polyrhythm as Rubin's vase, something we call a bistable percept, suggesting that are you seeing a vase or are you seeing a face? You could see either one, and it may alternate for you depending on your perception. A polyrhythm is a similar bistable percept. Do you hear the 3 as the bass with the 2 as a variant against it, or do you hear the 2 as the bass and the 3 as the variant? So, so our questions were about how does the brain track polyrhythm, and regarding entrainment, the idea is that the brain, in listening to a repeating rhythm, synchronizes to that rhythm, so that there's neural activity at the frequency of the rhythm that you're listening to. That 4 on the floor at 120 beats per minute corresponds to a neural oscillation of 2 hertz. And could we distinguish this locked oscillation from an auditory evoked potential, which is just your brain's reaction to the sound? You hear the sound, and the process of perceiving that sound creates an electrical signal. And could we distinguish those? Could we distinguish the sync from the reaction, let's say? And then what were the relationships between training, the strength of that entrainment, and musical performance? We thought that there would be a positive relationship between musical training, entrainment strength, and musical accuracy. And this, you're going to have to forgive me, I'm going to skip some slides. I know that that's poor form, but I put way more stuff in here than any of us really want to hear about. So I'm going to jump through this. And it takes us back here, which is, I'm just going to reinforce this idea that repetitious rhythm is creating repetitious brain activity, let's say. So the paradigm that we developed was to have a stick figure come in. We had friends and colleagues come in and be our subjects, people ranging from no musical experience to a percussionist with the Komische Oper. And so people were wearing headphones and an EEG net. They had an electronic drum. Wait a minute, I got a picture of this somewhere. That, okay, that's what it looks like, right? So you would hear 3 bars of a polyrhythm, and then there would be 1 bar of silence, then there would be a cue. One or the other rhythm would be played. The 2 components of the polyrhythm were sounded by different instruments, a wood block and a snare drum. I'll play it for you in a second. The idea behind the bar of silence is that it would give us a period in which we could evaluate the EEG data in the absence of stimulus. And if we saw these oscillations continuing in the absence of stimulus, we knew that this was entrainment. This was the brain synchronizing to the rhythm that subjects were attending to. And then once they were cued, whether to play the triple rhythm or the duple rhythm, they hit the drum, and we recorded their responses, and were able to compare this to their musical training and to their EEG data. We used Ableton Live to program and capture some of this data, which was interesting to me to be able to take my digital audio gear and do brain science with it. So let's see if I can play you what this thing sounded like. The ghost of Steve Jobs is not cooperating with my multimedia operation here. Let's see if this. Let's do it like this. So this is this polyrhythmic stimulus. And people had to listen to this 150 times. They were very gracious to tolerate it. And that's the cue. And following that cue, subjects would have to hit the drum. If it was a woodblock sound, bar of silence, cue. So depending on the sound, you hear the woodblock, you hear the snare drum, you're cued to respond in that rhythm. And what's interesting about that sound, it's as simple as a polyrhythm could be. But in listening to it, you could hear either the snare drum as the pulse, or you could hear the woodblock as the pulse, and different people hear it different ways. Sometimes you start hearing it one way and then it switches. And for those of us who had to listen to it over and over, it became really deeply ingrained. What we found was that musical training correlated positively with musical accuracy, which you might expect. We found that increased oscillatory power at the frequency of the rhythms correlated with accuracy. And this increase in oscillatory power is kind of our measure of entrainment. Is the brain tracking this rhythm? Is it synchronized, shall we say? And we did see these oscillations continuing through the silent period, which tells us that's entrainment. And we found oscillatory power at 3.5 hertz, which so the duple rhythm, the snare drum, was happening at a frequency of 1.166 hertz, the triple at a frequency of 175. So the blue star is in the frequency spectra of the EEG data that we recorded. There's this peak at the duple rhythm frequency. Interestingly, we didn't find a peak at the triple rhythm frequency, but we did find this tall peak at the first common harmonic of the two rhythm frequencies, which means basically that your brain's trying to track these two independent rhythms that don't resolve easily, but doing that in a sort of an integrated manner at the multiples of those two frequencies, if that makes sense. And so what we found is that the more trained you are as a musician, the stronger that oscillatory power, that entrainment at that common frequency. We also, through the algorithmic wizardry of Dr. Gunnar Watterstraat, we were able to see this correlation between accuracy and entrainment. And so you see here, this is when the stimulus is being played. This is the silence period, and we see this oscillation continue through the silence, which reinforces this idea that we're seeing an entrained oscillation. So what does it all mean? It's interesting to me that we are sort of wired to synchronize. And I think it's interesting, everybody's talking about club culture and music culture. There's obviously something very visceral and deep in our wiring that leads us to repetitious rhythm, and it leads us to experiencing it in a communal way. We could all dance at home by ourselves, and certainly I do on occasion, but it's way more fun to be in a room full of people, everybody listening to the same tempo, everybody listening to the same beat. And so there are these ideas about what does all of this mean in our brains? And to me, well, I put this up, so I'm just gonna say some words about it. Basically, there's an idea that our perceptual systems, our brains, are operating at in an oscillatory fashion, and as we perceive stimuli coming to us, either auditorily, visually, our brains are trying to lock to that frequency so that our perceptual accuracy is increased. And so there are several theories about this. There's also this idea, the predictive coding hypothesis, which I'm totally not going to explain sufficiently, but just go with me. The thing that I take away from it is that our brains are sort of built to predict. We create a model of our environment, and we use that model to predict what is going to happen in the future. And if our predictions don't match what we're experiencing, then there's an error term, and our brain wants to minimize that error term and So what it says to me is that we like to predict, and musical rhythm is to some degree, or to be locked to musical rhythm is to some degree to predict when the next beat is going to happen. You're not reacting to every beat when you're dancing. You know that that beat is coming, and your movement is prepared, and you are locked to that rhythm. And so, to me, I think part of our fascination with participating in rhythm has to do with the communion kind of between people. We're all sharing this same synchronicity, but it's also that our brains like to predict and we like to be right. And so every time we're there with the beat, it's gratifying to us. And I have nothing empirical to back that up, but I got the microphone, so you got to listen to what I'm saying. This is something that's super fascinating to me. I'm just going to drop this in at the end. There's this researcher, Neil P.M. Todd, who has this, what he calls the vestibular theory of rhythm. And in 1999, 2000, he was at the University of Manchester and went to clubs in the neighborhood and took measurements about frequency, spectra, and sound pressure levels in the clubs. He went back to the laboratory. He took a kick drum from a techno record, and he brought people into his laboratory, and he played this sound at really high volume in their ears, from like 90 decibels to 125, something like this. And so while these people are getting this kick drum in their ear, he's also measuring the electrical activity in the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is like from beneath your ear to your collarbone. And what he found was that at high sound pressure levels, there is activity in this muscle. And I think about this every time I am standing next to a giant speaker and my head is nodding. And you think about this muscle as a resonant body. It's under tension, sort of like a guitar string maybe, and so there is vibration being transduced from this giant speaker to our muscles, to our bones, our lungs, our resonant cavities. And so we're picking up a lot of information bodily. We experience it as sound, but it's something that is being detected through all of these other different sensory modalities, including your vibrotactile senses, which is a sexy science word, vibrotactile. But anyway, so this theory is basically saying that, adjacent to the inner ear are these three semicircular canals which tell us about the orientation of our body. Are we moving forward? Are we stationary? Is my head tilted? It's like the gyroscopes in your iPhone. And so the concept here in this theory is that that part of our experience of musical rhythm is an experience of bodily motion. That because the semicircular canals are adjacent to the eardrum, it's possible that vibrations are being transduced from the eardrum to the vestibular organs, which would manifest as an experience of forward motion, of bodily motion. So Professor Todd posits that we like to sit in a rocking chair, we like to swing on a swing, we like repetitious cyclical bodily motion, and so rhythm is a component of that. And certainly when we're dancing, which Dr. Todd calls vestibular self-stimulation, which is another super sexy science word for dancing. I think that this is fascinating, and as a drummer, it is resonant. It's a resonant idea for me that what we think of as an auditory experience actually sort of feels like motion, even if we're not dancing. And so I'll leave you with that. Oh, wait, no, I'm not. I'm going to leave you with this. Here's my last bit of fascinating idea. So the stimulus that I played for you, this 3/2 polyrhythm. Oh, let's see if I can get this thing up. Right. If you take that rhythm and you speed it up, that 3/2, if you speed it up, this is what happens. Let's just give it a whirl here. Turn it up. think you get the idea. Basically, the point here is that you can take a rhythm, and if you speed it up, there's a point at which it ceases to be a rhythm and it becomes a tone. In this case, the 3/2 polyrhythm becomes a perfect fifth, the musical interval. I don't know, this just freaks me out. The fact that, there's some kind of point, maybe this is something we'll address in the laboratory someday, but basically, just consider that your experience of a pitch, of an interval or a rhythm is really sort of subjective based on the way that our perceptual systems handle the speed of these waveforms. And so that's fascinating. Maybe you agree, maybe not. Maybe there's another slide, but maybe not. That's it. Okay, we're done. Here are some references. Let's look at that. And yeah, that's what I got for you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Any questions from
Thank
the
you.
audience? Yeah, there is two questions.
Thank you for your stunning talk,
Thanks for
the
listening.
presentation. I'm interested in listening to white noise for concentrating or as a sleeping aid. And I was wondering if there is any entrainment observable in this auditory stimulus.
That's an interesting question. I'm inclined to think that, certainly there's some sort of brain activity corresponding to what you're hearing, whether that manifests in, on what scale that is rhythmic. I couldn't exactly say, given that white noise is like broadband and across the frequency spectrum. This is an interesting question. Oh, sorry. And one that I could bullshit you, but that would just be dishonest. Actually, when we're done, come see me and we can talk. But it's interesting that there are a lot of products and techniques that are popular where people are trying to kind of take advantage of these psychoacoustic phenomena. The binaural beats, I don't know if you're familiar with this, is a similar sort of thing. And I think that this phenomenon of entrainment has potential for therapeutic purpose in the sense that you're able to induce particular oscillatory activity by using musical frequencies, either pitch or rhythm, and possibly this kind of broadband white noise like you're talking about. So that's something that I hope that we get the chance to dig into in the future.
Two more questions, Angela.
Hi.
Hi.
So you mentioned if an audience is listening to music or sound or rhythm, they're getting entrained. In the case of a live performer or DJ or somebody else who's producing that output or controlling that output, and they're getting entrained to the entrainment of the people responding. So it's kind of like meta-entrainment or something.
For sure.
Do you have any sort of science to talk about the meta-entrainment, especially as a performer, you learning from the audience's response?
Yeah, that's an interesting point to make, that it's sort of that it becomes like a feedback loop, that I entrain to you, you entrain to me, and that we have a sort of bidirectional communication. And definitions of entrainment vary. If you're talking about perceptual neuroscience, entrainment is sort of a one-way thing from a stimulus to my brain entrains to a stimulus. But in the case of, if we talk about entrainment in a musicological sense, that sort of bidirectional phenomenon is really important, and I think it's a kind of characteristic of the way that humans interact. You know, that we that we seek to align. You know, and that is like an accommodation on the part of both parties. You know, and I think music is a super cool example of that. That you know, certainly a DJ can read a crowd, and you know, the dancing and the you know, I think of like a like a ballroom in the big band era, you know, when you had 15 musicians on stage and someone conducting and a whole room full of people dancing. The number of levels of kind of synchronicity are nested really really densely.
I was told that in some traditions, like musical traditions, this idea of the audience responding is just as important as musician performing. But obviously, I don't have a reference point or any kind of scientific way to back that up. But I was told that that's a thing. That
yeah. Well, you know, I think like in our academic study of music performance, it's important to remember that so much music research has happened in a very narrow span of the human phenomenon of music, that it's, you know, Western tonal concert music of the late 20th century, you know, is kind of what we talk about. But over the span of human history, so much music has been made not by professionals performing for an audience, but like, you know, the guy who lives next door and you are around the campfire, or, you know, that that it's participatory and not hierarchical. You know what I mean?
I see. Thanks.
Yeah. One last question.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could specify the means by which the brain actually entrains to the rhythm. I was thinking that, to my knowledge, dogs and cats also have the ear canal structure, so they could hear a beat and then entrain to it. But we don't see cats or dogs, for instance, getting into music, particularly in front of the stereo or anything. I've never seen that happen.
Yeah.
Why would it happen to humans?
That's a super interesting question. Yeah, there recently there is a parrot called Alex that like bobs its head to Backstreet Boys songs, which I find disturbing. But there's actually a sea lion in San Diego who has been trained to similarly bob her head to disco, which I think is much better. I would rather watch a sea lion dance to disco than a parrot dance to Backstreet Boys, but that's me.
True, but they were paid to do that, right? With food.
You're probably true. So it appears unique in the animal world. The human ability to discern periodicity in the audio stream seems unique, and so one of the suggestions is that it has to do with our capacity for language, maybe. Part of the neural resources for making music are shared with language-making resources. So there was this hypothesis that animals that, because this parrot and because the parrot is a vocal learner, the parrot doesn't grow up talking. It hears its conspecifics making sounds and it imitates those sounds, and that was hypothesized to be the thing, that if a creature can imitate sounds, then maybe it has the capacity to detect that kind of periodicity. But the sea lion is not a vocal learner, so that kind of threw that hypothesis off. It's mysterious, you know, the like what music is to the brain is strange. It's an emergent thing, you know, that where it came from and why it's so compelling to us is very mysterious. And also, like, how does it work? You know, when you think about what's going on, musicians on stage or people dancing, you know, the calculations that your brain is making in order to just discern a chord are very complex, lightning fast. And similarly with music, if you you go to see a DJ and the difference between like really feeling the groove of what you're hearing versus being like meh, is like microseconds. This micro timing in a rhythm that's repeating over and over. It's just fractions of a second, and so it's a super mysterious mechanism, but it's one that I'm glad that we've got. You know what I mean?
One more very short question, if anyone has. Yeah, then the last one.
Yeah, I was wondering about arrhythmic music, how the brain entrains to rapidly shifting oscillations or rapidly shifting rhythms.
Did you say arrhythmic music?
Arrhythmic, yes.
That's an interesting question. Actually, the other night I was in this very room listening to some deeply arrhythmic music, and I was thinking about like what that is. Especially some of your more abstract, very ambient music. How do we how does that manifest in the brain? What's going on there? Especially because the majority of music, kind of in human culture that we know of, has been rhythmic. I think in that case, so there are kind of the brain processes rhythmic material through structures that are related to motor activity, the movement of your body. Things like pitch and harmony are processed through your auditory cortex. So there's sort of a divergence about like where that processing is happening. I mean, it makes sense to me that like rhythm and motion go together, would be handled by similar structures. In the case of something arrhythmic, I expect that would be primarily in the part of your brain that is traditionally associated with hearing. And so there are, there's a whole separate system that is tracking frequencies and their relationships to each other, harmonies, and so that is what is probably very active if you're listening to music that has harmonic content but no rhythmic content. But that's an interesting question.
Okay, thank you so much.